So we're on Ayin Dalet Omid Beis, and the last thing we discussed was this compromise shita of Rabbeinu David. Again, the issue, just to reiterate for the third time, is whether or not we can punish someone who was obligated to give up their life, but because of the fear of death, they did not do so, they violated the Torah. And here's where Rabbeinu David came up with his compromise shita. He says it depends. If the violation was Avera Kala B'Farhesia, then there's no punishment. But if it was for the Gimel Averes Chamuros, then there is a punishment. So in the case of Farhesia, L'chora, that's called Ones. In other words, Rabbeinu David holds that if you violated an Aver because of the fear of death, and out of you were compelled and coerced to do so, then you're not chayav an onus because you're an onus. So the question is, why doesn't that same logic apply to Gimel Averes Chamuros? And there again, we should say, well, he only violated whatever he did because he was forced to do so, and therefore he should be poter midin onus. So he suggested that according to Rabbeinu David, the only ptur of ones could apply when we have a matir, a heter of pikuach nefesh of v'chai bohem. In Gimel Averes Chamuros, we have no heter of v'chai bohem. Because of the Chumas Avera, there's no v'chai bohem. And therefore, there's no ptur of ones. So the Chomer HaIsa removes two things. We've always been differentiating between pikuach nefesh v'chai bohem on the one hand, and onus on the other hand. Now we're saying no. There's an interdependence, and if there's a pikuach nefesh, then there's a ptur of onus. If there's no pikuach nefesh, then there's no ptur onus. You know what I mean by pikuach nefesh? I'm not talking about whether the life is in danger or not. I'm talking about whether the Torah would allow you to violate the Torah. V'chai bohem v'lo sheyamos bohem. Well, that doesn't apply in the Gimel Averes Chamuros, and in Mela there's no ptur of onus. The fact that you were compelled to violate one of the three Averes Chamuros, and it was not a willing decision on your part, that's not a mitigating circumstance. And the power of onus to exempt you from punishment does not apply in those cases where there's no power to v'chai bohem. And that's why if you violated any of the Gimel Averes Chamuros, even though you did so because you were compelled to do so and because it was under threat of death, you're still going to be chayav because there's no pikuach nefesh with regard to the Gimel Averes Chamuros. But in Shari Yisurim B'Farhesia, there is a matter pikuach nefesh, just that there's a mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, and therefore there's also a ptur of ones. So again, you have to give it your life publicly for any Avera, but that's because of the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. That's not generated by pikuach nefesh. And therefore, if you violate Shari Yisurim B'Farhesia, you're not going to be punished in the way you normally should be punished because there is a ptur of ones. And the ptur of ones is engendered by the halacha v'chai bohem, which applies in Shar Averos. You were mavatel the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, fine, but we can't kill you or punish you because of your bittul of Kiddush Hashem. The Rambam disagrees. And the Rambam holds that there's a ptur of ones independent of pikuach nefesh. And even if we suspend pikuach nefesh with regard to the Gimel Averes Chamuros, nevertheless, there's still a ptur of ones. So Rambam doesn't distinguish between the Gimel Averes Chamuros and Shar Averes B'Farhesia. There's always going to be a din of ptur ones. Okay, that's as far as the Rambam in onus. Now we talk about the Rambam in the case of Misrapin, right? In Perikei Halacha Vav. The Rambam says that if a person is ill and his life is in the balance, and the physicians tell him that if he violates an Isur Torah, he can save his life. And Allah is misrapim b'chol Isur shebet Torah. Then in the case of sakona, there's pikuach nefesh v'chai b'hem, chutz me'avodah zara, gilei arayos u'shvichas damim. That there in those three sins, even in a case of sakana, ein misrapim b'hem. But chai b'hem does not apply to those three averos. And therefore, says the Rambam, im avar v'nisrape onshim also bezdin onesh haroilam. That means that if he violated one of the three averos in order to save his life, he will be punished. And the question is why? I mean, we said that the Rambam extends the principle of ones and applies it even to Gimel Averos Chamuros. And he gave up on the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem for the sake of saving his life. That's called Yiras HaMaves. Here also, he gave up his life. He violated the Isur because of Yiras HaMaves. So why is it that in the case of Gimel Averos Chamuros, the Rambam holds he's exempt from punishment, he's exonerated? But in the case of Refuah, there the Rambam says that Onshin also Bezdin Onesh HaRoil. And in the past, we tried to justify this Rambam by saying that there's a difference between an external onus and an internal onus. You may remember that discussion. Now, at this point, I want to read to you the Ramban in Milchamas Hashem on the Rif Daf Yud Ches. The Ode, the Amrina Lekamon, the Oso Shenosan Eno Be'isha Achas, the Helalibatino. So the case came in front of the Chachamim, and they were speaking about a man whose life was in danger. And again, strangely enough, in this scenario, the only way of saving his life is if we allow him to have an immoral relationship with a woman. And the halach is Yomos v'alti boilo. He's got to die. If that's what's going to happen, we're not going to allow this be'ilah. And one opinion is that she was an Eishes Ish. So that's Gilei Arayos, and then it's also. So Ramban says, Laman Yom Eishes Ish Havir is Shapir, the Gilei Arayos Havir V'Osu. And the Ramban points out, so we had the sheet of Rava to explain Esther, because Achashverosh, right, he didn't know that she was Jewish, and he was only interested in Anos Atzmo, and therefore she was allowed to do what she did. But here we have a case of Anos Atzmo, we don't allow it. B'im Tomar, Shiny Hossam, the Leka Onsala Isisa. Maybe you'll say the following, okay. You might say, well, as far as he's concerned, as a Boel, it's Hanos Atzmo, and he's Onus, his life was at stake. But what about her? What's going to be matter her as an Eishes Ish to have this relationship I mean, she doesn't have an onus. There's no onus for her. Maybe that's why it's also. Holav Milsa. He says, Ramban, that's not a worthy argument. The cave unto EU onis onso de gufa. All the Ika Ibud Nefesh Misrael onus mikra. We don't need that both he and she should have an onus. We just have to prevent the loss of a life. And therefore, if there'll be an Ibud Nefesh Misrael, then that onus applies to her as well. She also has to save his life, so to speak. So therefore, the principle of onus would kick in. But again, we're dealing with Gilei Arayos, and therefore there's no heter. But in any event, you see one thing for this Ramban. The Ramban is talking about Helo Libo Tina, which is a case of choli, some sort of very extreme psychological choli, and yet the Ramban calls it onus. So this is not an external onus. This is internal. So we see that a chol is considered an onus. And that's the Ramban Shita, that a chol is considered an onus. Even though, again, there's no external onus. It's all internal. I seem to be missing something here in my notes, which is a shame. Let me just see. Where did I misplace this? So again, we see from the Ramban that choli is called ones, even for somebody else, it's called an ones. And that's called ibud nefesh miYisrael. That's an onus. So when we're preventing the death of someone, and that person, if we're a different set of circumstances and his life was not in danger, he would not want to, he has no interest and no intention to violate the Torah, but it's a situation that's compelled against him, then it's ones, and not only for he himself who's a chol, but even for others. That's called ibud nefesh miYisrael. So now, according to Ramban, the whole distinction that we made in understanding the Rambam about an external onus as opposed to the refuah case where it's not an external onus at all, that seems to fall by the wayside. The Ramban seems to operate with a whole different set of premises, and that is that chola and refuah, even though it's not an external onus, nevertheless it's still considered onus. Now, again, it's not really fair to impose the Ramban Shita onto the Rambam, but if we want to do so, why does the Rambam make a distinction between a chole who went ahead and he was nisrape be'echad migimel averes chamuris, therefore manishin also, we're going to punish him in that punishment that's suitable for him. Whereas if he was over ba'ones, then the Rambam Shita is that we don't punish him the way he should be. So we say that in refuah, because there's no external onus, he's not called an onus, and therefore he will be punished. But if it's an external onus, like in the case of Gimel Averis Chamuras, etc., Shar Averis Farhesia, there he's not going to be punished because it's an onus. But that doesn't stem with the Ramban, because the Ramban says that even in the case of refuah, it's considered an onus. So let's again go back to the words of the Rambam. And I think we've mentioned in the past that according to Reb Chaim, the Rambam doesn't have in mind, when he says Manishin so bionish haroilo, that we put him to death or we give him malchus, but rather what the Rambam has in mind is makas mardus or nidu yashamta, some other punishment that's royalo, that he deserves, but not the onish of Misa and Malchus. That's how Reb Chaim wants to interpret the words of the Rambam. So even Choli is considered an onus. He's potter from Malchus, he's potter from Misa, but you know what? We'll give makas mardus, we'll put him into nidu yashamta. And if that be the case, the Rambam is very meduyak, because if we go back to halachas, to Perkei Halacha Daled, the Rambam writes Misha Ovar below Nera She'ein Bezin Malkin also Misan also, and then we get again fast forwarding to back to Halacha Vav Im Ovar v'Nisrapi v'Odazor Gilurai. She was on Onshim also Bezdin Onish Haroilo. I mean, the Rambam should have said that Over and Israpi Bavodazor Gilarashi Chastovim Malkin also or Memisan also. Why did the Rambam use the language Manishin also Bezdin be Onish Haroilo? And the answer has to be that even in the case of Chola, there's a P'tur of onus. And ain't Bezdin Malkin or Memisan also. Hello, what the Rambam means when he says Manishin also Bonish Haroilo, that's Makas Mardus or Nidui or Shamt. Now again, let's go over Tosfos one more time. Tosfos wants to know why the Gemara didn't ask from Esther Gila Rayas Havi. And Tosfos answers that it was partial to the Gemara that Gila Rayas by an Isha the Neveles, and she's Karka Olam, for sure there would be no din of Yeharg Val Yav. In other words, a Karka Olam would certainly be a mitigating factor as far as Gilead Rice is concerned. And the question is why? I mean, the Gemara in Bava Kama that we spoke about many times, Hishva Kosev Isha Le'ish, Dichsiv V'nichrusu Anafasha Osos, a woman participating in an immoral act is considered like Nefashas Osos. So she's Naya for Gilead Rayas, and she will be put to death, despite the fact that she's Karka Olam. And we mentioned the Ran, the Muki Yosef, that if they could have done the action against her will, even if she refuses to comply, then that's totally different. However, there is another possible approach here. I'm looking at my watch. Maybe we'll stop a little early, but let me just try to suggest this, at least as Haschola. I'm not sure. Does John come on Sundays? Maybe not. I don't know. So he says the following, that perhaps even in Gimel Averis Chamuros, there's a matir pikuach nefesh. But on the other hand, there still is an iser because of the Chumras Havera. So it means that there's a difference between Shara Averos and Gimel Averos. In Shara Averos, there's a mitzvah pikuach nefesh of a chaybah. And that overrides the iser entirely. And with regard to that iser, that Avera, it's mutter. But in Gimel Averos, pikuach nefesh is shakul keneged Avera. All right, so this is something that we'll have to, Belinetta, take up in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay, then? So let me take this opportunity to wish you a great day. And thank you so much.